Are you ready to face the unsettling truths of camping in the great outdoors? This video reveals spine-chilling park ranger horror stories that could save your life on your next adventure. We'll dive into the real dangers lurking in national parks and how to prepare for them. Don't miss the shocking twist at the end that could make all the difference between a fun trip and a nightmare. I had spent 9 summers in the nation's oldest national park, and I thought I'd seen it all. For 3 of those years, I worked backcountry law enforcement, often going out alone for 9 days at a time. Most of my nights were spent in cozy cabins, but sometimes I'd take a backpacking trip to patrol the boundaries and keep an eye out for poachers. It was peaceful work, or so I thought, until I stumbled across something that sent shivers down my spine. One sunny afternoon, while hiking along a tranquil trail that hugged a gently flowing stream, I rounded a bend and found the most curious sight: a tent pitched right next to the path. Camping outside designated campsites is a huge no-no in the park, so my first thought was that someone had broken the rules. As I approached, the smell of cigarette smoke hit me, thick and stale. It didn't take long for my unease to grow. Inside the tent I found a cloth sleeping bag, a heap of dirty clothes, and a disturbing amount of food, including large cans of SpaghettiOs and some leftovers that looked like they came from a refried beans and rice dinner. But what struck me most was a well-loved teddy bear sitting in the corner, its fur matted and dusty. I didn't see any personal belongings that indicated a family or group. Everything suggested one individual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite my instinct to pack everything up and move along, I hesitated. I didn't want to leave someone out here with nothing. Instead, I took the food and secured it in a food storage box along the trail, leaving a note to the person, explaining where I'd stashed it and urging them to relocate. It felt like a strange compromise, and I had a nagging sense of dread as I walked away, the peaceful sounds of the stream now grating on my nerves. It was 2 weeks before I could return to that spot, too long to leave a tent unattended. When I finally got back, it was as if time had stood still. The tent remained untouched, a ghost of its former life. I packed up the remaining gear and took a moment to survey the area, searching for any signs of the person who had camped there. But all I found were the faint echoes of rain sounds and rustling leaves. Blending into the eerie silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was alone in the woods, the peacefulness of my surroundings suddenly feeling menacing. With the tent packed away and the site cleared, I thought that was the end of it. But that nagging unease lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. The following days back at the cabin felt oddly unsettling. Nighttime stories around the campfire usually filled the air with laughter and camaraderie. But this time, my colleagues noticed my distracted demeanor. "You okay?" one of them asked after I zoned out during a particularly spooky tale about past park rangers facing unknown dangers. I shrugged it off, but the discomfort stayed with me. Each time I stepped outside, the familiar sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets and rustling leaves, felt different. I often found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. It was ridiculous. I had trained myself to be rational in the face of fear, but this was different. Something about that abandoned campsite gnawed at me, filling my mind with narratives scary enough to keep me awake at night. As I turned in for the evening, the rain began to patter against the roof of the cabin, a soft rhythm that usually soothed me to sleep. Tonight, however, it felt more like a warning. The sound of rain grew louder, creating a chilling soundtrack as I settled into bed. I tried to distract myself with thoughts of the upcoming patrol, but my mind kept returning to that tent. Who had left it there? Where had they gone? The questions spiraled, turning my imagination into a horror compilation of possible scenarios. I dismissed them as paranoia, yet a part of me remained convinced that something was wrong. I lay there in the darkness, trying to find comfort in the rain sounds and the creaking of the old cabin. But then I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the rain. It was distant but persistent, as if someone were calling out from deep within the woods. I sat up, heart racing, straining to catch another hint of the sound. Was it the wind playing tricks on me? Or was it something more sinister? I climbed out of bed and peered out the window, but the rain obscured my view, cloaking everything in a dense fog. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize the unease creeping in. Yet, Deep down, I felt a flicker of dread. It wasn't just the whisper that unsettled me. It was the idea that someone might have returned to that campsite, still waiting for something, or someone. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, hoping to drown out the unsettling thoughts with sleep. But the fear hung over me, a constant reminder of that one ghostly tent and the abandoned teddy bear. Morning broke, bringing with it a thin veil of fog that hung over the park like a shroud. I felt exhausted. Having barely slept through the night, the haunting whispers and rain sounds lingered in my mind, tainting the fresh air with a sense of foreboding. As I prepared for my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to revisit that site. I grabbed my gear, determination mixing with trepidation as I set out toward the trail. With each step, the quiet of the woods seemed to amplify the echo of my thoughts. What if I found something? Or someone? I shook my head, trying to quell my growing anxiety. As I approached the familiar bend in the trail, a chill ran down my spine. The tent was gone. Just gone. The space where it had once stood was now just a patch of grass, bare and unsettlingly empty. My heart raced, confusion flooding my mind. Had I imagined it all? I knelt where the tent had been, scanning the ground for any signs of a struggle or evidence that someone had come back. Everything seemed untouched, like the spot had never been disturbed. But just then, I noticed something: tiny footprints, faint but distinguishable, leading into the dense thicket nearby. My pulse quickened, and a sense of dread enveloped me. I was alone out here, and the thought of following those tracks made my stomach twist. Get a grip, I told myself, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. But I was the only one there, and the woods had grown eerily silent. I stepped cautiously into the thicket, the underbrush crunching beneath my boots, amplifying the tension in the air. The trees loomed like sentinels, shadows shifting and swaying as if alive, watching my every move. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed back, a mocking reminder of my solitude. As I ventured deeper, I could hear faint whispers again, just on the edge of perception. My heart thudded in my chest, fear creeping in like a chill. They felt familiar, almost like the echoes of forgotten bedtime stories, twisted into something menacing. I pressed on, unable to turn back now. I had to know what was happening, even as part of me screamed to retreat. I rounded a corner and stumbled upon a clearing, the sunlight filtering through the trees. In the center stood a pile of items, and my stomach dropped as I recognized some of the gear from the tent: the dirty clothes, the teddy bear, and a small campfire ring with remnants of burnt food. It was as if someone had been preparing for something, but no one was there to claim it. A sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized I was part of something much darker than I'd ever anticipated. I stood frozen, the remnants of the campsite sending a cold wave of panic through me. My heart hammered in my chest, drowning out the usual sounds of the forest. I took a step closer, compelled by a morbid curiosity to piece together what had happened. The teddy bear lay atop a pile of clothes, its button eyes staring blankly at me. It felt almost accusatory, as if it were demanding an explanation for the chaos around it. As I examined the items, a sense of unease deepened. Who had been here? Had they returned to claim their belongings, or had they vanished into the woods? I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whispers echoed around me, now clearly discernible, but they made no sense, a jumble of words floating through the air like lost thoughts. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out, but something compelled me to stay. I knelt beside the fire ring, examining the charred remnants of what looked like the same leftovers I'd found at the abandoned campsite. A chill swept through me as I realized the uneaten food could only mean one thing. Whoever had camped here had either left, or had something else forced them to abandon it. The weight of the situation began to settle heavily on my shoulders, and I felt a sudden wave of nausea. Just as I made to stand, I heard a sudden rustling behind me. My heart lurched as I whipped around, scanning the tree line for movement. The whispers grew louder, swirling in a cacophony of indistinct sounds, pushing me to the brink of panic. I stepped back instinctively, only to trip over a root and fall, landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but I barely noticed. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me, and I began to retreat. As I turned to run, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure emerging from the thicket. Panic surged, and I felt my breath quicken. It was just a glimpse, but it was enough to freeze me in place. The whispers intensified, merging into a single voice that seemed to beckon me. I had to get out of there. The tales of park rangers' horror stories swirled in my mind. All the eerie legends I'd dismissed as mere folklore suddenly feeling far too real. I stumbled back towards the trail, my heart pounding in my ears. The further I went, the more the whispers faded, but their chilling echoes clung to me like a haunting melody. By the time I reached the safety of the cabin, I was breathless, each step feeling heavier than the last. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, but the sense of dread remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the safety of my walls. That night, as the rain pattered against the roof, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had swallowed a part of me. I lay awake, surrounded by familiar comforts, yet feeling more isolated than ever. The whispers, the lost teddy bear, and the abandoned campsite all lingered in my thoughts, a chilling reminder that in these woods, some stories remain unfinished, forever lost among the trees, waiting for someone to unravel their mysteries. And thus, the echoes of true park rangers' horror stories would haunt my dreams long after the summer ended, a reminder that sometimes it's better not to seek the answers to the questions that linger in the dark. Do you think you know what lurks in the dark? Join me as I unveil chilling true stories that will make you question everything about your own backyard. These are not just scary tales. They are horrifying accounts from park rangers who face the unimaginable. Stick around to discover the secrets they uncovered, because the truth is far more terrifying than fiction. I've been a seasonal ranger for just over a month now, and let me tell you, this job has a way of throwing unexpected horrors at you. I thought working in the forest preserves would be a peaceful way to spend my summer, surrounded by trees and the sounds of nature. But that tranquility often masks darker truths lurking in the shadows of the woods. Despite the suburban sprawl surrounding us, these forests hold stories some true. It was a chilly, overcast day, the kind that makes you want to stay in bed with a good book. I was driving my patrol route, the rain drumming steadily against the windshield, creating a rhythm that could almost lull you to sleep. But I was wide awake, eyes scanning the dense foliage. I lost sight of the road for a moment as I navigated a particularly winding stretch when suddenly a clearing appeared before me. That's when I saw him, a man hanging lifelessly from a tree, swaying slightly in the breeze. My stomach dropped as I parked the truck, the rain mixing with the cold sweat creeping down my back. I grabbed my radio, my hands shaking, and called it in. "We've got a situation. I found a body." I couldn't even bring myself to say it out loud. The coroner took his sweet time arriving, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the haunting image of a man who had lost everything. I found myself staring at the gruesome scene, a part of me wishing I could unsee it, another part gripping tightly to the reality of the moment. This was the job, right? To confront the worst of humanity head on. While waiting for the coroner, I tried to distract myself by thinking about how often the rangers mentioned the suicide statistics in the area one a year. They said, like clockwork, yet here I was living the horror story that others would tell later. The rain sounds drummed steadily around me, blending with the heavy silence of the clearing. I glanced around, feeling oddly exposed, as if the trees themselves were eavesdropping on my horror. The coroner finally showed up, ladder in tow, but that didn't make the hour any easier. I couldn't shake the sense of dread settling in my stomach. When he cut the man down, the lifeless body fell, hitting the ground with a thud that echoed in the stillness. It felt like the forest itself held its breath, the weight of what had just happened sinking deep into damp earth. Just another day in the life of a park ranger, right? I couldn't help but think of the stories I'd heard, horror stories and scary tales, where the forest hides its dark secrets just out of sight. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of what lay beneath. Each rustle in the bushes made me jump, and I felt an unsettling chill creep along my spine. My thoughts turned to the future. What other nightmares awaited me in these woods? I had barely begun my journey, and the real work had just started. The rain continued to fall, leaving the forest floor slick and treacherous. After the body was taken away, I drove back to the ranger station, still rattled from what I'd witnessed. The weight of that sight lingered like a storm cloud overhead, dampening my spirits. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted a couple of other rangers gathered near the building, their voices low and tense. Something was off. I could feel it in the air, thick with anticipation. One of the rangers waved me over, his eyes wide with urgency. "You won't believe what just happened," he said, glancing around as if the trees themselves might be listening. "We had a call about a crazed guy running around the parking lot, naked as the day he was born." I couldn't help but chuckle a little at the absurdity. "What? Seriously?" I asked, trying to picture the scene, but the laughter died in my throat when I saw the look on his face. This was no joke. We split into teams to look for the guy, my heart racing with a mix of curiosity and dread. The rain had turned the ground to a mud pit, and every step felt like a gamble. "He was high on something," another ranger explained, "just tearing through the underbrush." As we searched, I imagined what kind of mind would lead a person to such a state, what horrors he must have been running from. I felt a creeping unease, wondering what I would do if I encountered him alone. We finally spotted him huddled near a tree, panting and wide-eyed, his body marred with scratches. It took 3 of us to bring him down, our hands grappling with his wild limbs. When we finally restrained him, I couldn't believe the sight. A rock lodged in his backside, blood and dirt caking his skin. He looked utterly lost, a tortured soul caught in a nightmare. It hit me then the woods were more than just trees and trails. They were a sanctuary for all kinds of stories, dark tales that echoed through the underbrush. After we called the authorities to take him away, I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. What kind of world was I stepping into? The rangers joked about this being just another day in the life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I looked back at the clearing where ID found the body earlier, I couldn't help but think about how quickly a normal day could spiral into chaos. The woods were alive, breathing stories that could turn your skin cold. Stories of horror and true fear that lingered long after the last echo faded away. That night, I tried to shake off the day's events, but they clung to me like the damp air that surrounded the forest. My mind was a carousel of unsettling images: the man in the tree, the crazed, naked guy. And now I was left to wonder what else these woods held. As I lay in my bunk at the ranger station, the rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm that accompanied my restless thoughts. I could hear the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves and distant calls of night creatures. But tonight they felt different, more sinister. The next morning we gathered for a briefing. The mood was somber, the previous day's incidents weighing heavily on us. One of the rangers, who had been patrolling the area near the river, shared a discovery that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "I found a headless deer down by the stream," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The head was cleanly severed and placed right next to the body. The other rangers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and concern. "Coyotes usually leave behind a mess," another ranger chimed in. This was too neat. My stomach twisted at the thought. What kind of person could do something like that? It sounded like the setup for one of those scary stories we told around campfires, the kind that kept you up at night wondering if the monster was real. But here we were, in a real-life horror story, and I couldn't escape it. We decided to check it out as a group, heading to the river with a mix of trepidation and curiosity. The path was slick from the rain, and as we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. There was something unnerving about being out in the woods after everything that had happened. I could almost feel the forest holding its breath, waiting for us to uncover whatever dark truth lay hidden in its depths. When we arrived at the spot, the sight was as unsettling as I had imagined. The deer lay there, its body still, but the head was missing, as if someone had intentionally set it aside. "This has to be some sick joke," one of the rangers muttered. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that whatever was happening here wasn't just the randomness of nature. It was something more calculated, more sinister. These woods were telling a story, and I was just beginning to understand the depths of their horror. As the rangers gathered around the headless deer, the weight of the situation settled heavily on our shoulders. The sun had dipped behind a thick curtain of clouds, casting a dim light over the scene. I felt a chill run down my spine, the unease from earlier creeping back in. "We should report this," I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew that something deep within me was reluctant. What would we even say? We found a headless deer. Could it be a ritual? An act of madness? The forest had its own language, one I was just beginning to comprehend. With the unsettling image of the deer imprinted in my mind, we decided to return to the ranger station and file our report. On the way back, the air felt charged, as if the forest was alive with whispers, secrets hidden just out of reach. The rain had stopped, but the dampness clung to everything, making the ground squelch beneath our boots. The sense of foreboding lingered like a storm cloud overhead, and every rustle of leaves seemed to echo louder than before. Back at the station, the gravity of our findings weighed heavily on us. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. "What kind of person does something like that?" one ranger finally asked, breaking the oppressive quiet. "It's not just nature, this is something else entirely." I could feel my heart race at the implications. This was becoming more than just a job. It was a descent into a darkness I never expected to face. The forest, once a serene backdrop, now felt like a labyrinth of horrors. Later that night, I lay in my bunk again, my mind racing with images of the day. I could hear the distant sounds of the forest outside. The rain had returned, softly pattering against the roof. I wanted to drift off, to find solace in sleep, but the stories swirling in my head kept me wide awake. I thought of the man in the tree, the naked runner, and the headless deer, all pieces of a terrifying puzzle that seemed to be assembling itself around me. Were these the true park rangers' horror stories that the old-timers warned us about? Just as I began to doze off, a loud crash jolted me awake. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. I rushed to the window, peering out into the darkened woods, but I saw nothing. The only sound was the rain, drumming a relentless beat against the glass. But deep down I knew the forest was hiding something from us, a darkness that was just beginning to reveal itself. Whatever haunted these woods, it wasn't done with me yet. This wasn't just my job anymore. It was a chilling journey into the unknown, and I could only hope to survive the night. And as I stood there, staring into the abyss of the forest, I realized that my life had become one of those chilling nighttime stories, the kind you tell as a sleep aid, to make the fear palpable, to give voice to the shadows lurking just beyond the light. Ever wondered what really lurks in the shadows of the forest? In this video, we're diving into a true horror story from a wildland firefighter who encountered something inexplicable while working alone in Hell's Canyon. If you've ever felt uneasy in the woods, you'll want to stick around. This story will make you rethink your next adventure. Don't miss out on the chilling details that could change the way you see nature forever. It was 2004 and I was working as a wildland firefighter with the U.S. Forest Service, soaking in the sights and sounds of Hell's Canyon in Idaho. The air was crisp, the kind that nips at your skin, and the scent of pine mingled with the earthy smell of damp soil. My crew had been at it all day, and we knew we'd be working late into the night. As the assistant superintendent, my job was to scout the area ahead on my trusty ATV, making sure everything was safe for my crew. The logging road I followed hadn't seen a vehicle in ages. It felt eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a bobcat appeared in the middle of the road. The creature stood frozen, staring right at me. For a solid 10 seconds it screamed an unearthly sound that echoed through the canyon before darting up a nearby tree. I was caught off guard, shaking my head at the bizarre encounter, but trying not to let it get to me. "It's just a wild animal," I told myself. After a while I stumbled upon a small cabin. It was strange, really. There shouldn't be any private structures on federal land. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The windows were boarded up tightly, as if the occupant had a fear of the outside world. The doorknob was gone, replaced by a chain that secured a hole drilled through the log frame. It didn't take long for the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up. Someone clearly wanted to keep something inside or keep it out. Feeling a chill creep down my spine, I decided it was time to head back up the road. As I reached the spot where I'd seen the bobcat, my heart dropped. There, standing where the cat had been, was a Native American woman. She wore a tattered nightgown, the fabric flapping in the breeze as if it had a life of its own. I called out to her, asking if she needed help, but instead of responding, she screamed. The sound was the same as the bobcat's, an echo of that primal fear. Before I could react, she shot up the tree with a speed I didn't think was possible. I bolted out of there, adrenaline surging through my veins. Who was that woman? What had I just witnessed? My mind raced with questions as I drove back, desperate to make sense of it all. I sought out a local guy later that night, sharing my strange encounter. As I recounted the details, a nearby Native American man overheard us. He looked at me, his expression serious, and said I had encountered a skinwalker, a shapeshifter from his culture, feared and respected. The thought rattled me. I had heard horror stories in the past, scary tales of creatures that blurred the lines between reality and nightmare. I knew I wouldn't sleep well that night, the chilling memories of what I saw lingering like shadows in my mind. The rain started to patter against the roof of our station, the sound both comforting and unnerving. It felt like the start of a long night of unsettling thoughts. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying narratives are the true stories we carry with us. That night, as I lay in my cot at the fire station, the echoes of the day replayed in my mind. The rain sounded relentless against the metal roof, creating a rhythm that mingled with the whispers of my crew chatting in low tones. I tried to focus on the familiar sounds, the crackling of the coffee pot, the shuffle of boots on the floor, but all I could hear was the shriek of that bobcat and the terrifying scream of the woman in the nightgown. My heart raced as I replayed the scene over and over, each time feeling the unease settle deeper in my gut. Just a wild animal, I whispered to myself, yet my mind wouldn't let it go. The forest had its secrets. I knew that well enough, and as much as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, part of me wondered if there was more to it. The concept of a skinwalker was a part of the local lore, but I'd never considered it anything but a scary story one meant to thrill around a campfire, not one I'd encounter in real life. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard a noise outside, a rustling, a whisper in the dark. My heart skipped, and I got up, peering out the window. All I could see was a thick wall of trees, their shadows dancing in the dim light of the moon. I brushed it off as my imagination, but deep down, something gnawed at me, an unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. It was then that I remembered the cabin. My instincts kicked in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more about it, to understand what I had stumbled upon. My supervisor had mentioned it to a couple of locals, but I hadn't thought to dig deeper. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way outside, the rain creating a soft melody that seemed to urge me on. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth, almost grounding me as I stepped into the night. I hopped on my ATV, my heart pounding not just from the fear but from an unexplainable curiosity. The path felt eerily familiar, yet the shadows seemed to stretch further tonight, reaching out like fingers in the darkness. I found myself retracing my route back to that small cabin, each bump in the road echoing through my body like a warning bell. As I approached, a chill swept through me, almost tangible, reminding me of the stories I'd heard about the woods at night, stories of things that lurked just beyond the light. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt an unsettling presence wrap around me. I trained my flashlight on the structure, illuminating the boarded windows and the chain on the door. It was as if the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something. A voice inside me whispered to leave, but another part urged me to stay. It was like a horror story unfolding right before my eyes, and I was both terrified and compelled to discover what lay hidden within those walls. I stood outside the cabin, the rain falling harder now, soaking through my gear. The sound of droplets splattering against the roof created a chaotic symphony, mingling with the unsettling silence that enveloped me. Each breath felt heavy with anticipation, as if the forest itself was watching. My flashlight flickered slightly, casting shadows that danced along the cabin's warped walls, playing tricks on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened here was far from over. Compelled by an inexplicable urge, I took a step closer to the door. The chain securing it rattled softly, almost in response to my presence. I wanted to know who had boarded this place up and why. My pulse quickened as I recalled the face of the woman I had seen earlier, her wild eyes reflecting something primal. With one last breath, I pushed the door, the wood creaking in protest. The darkness inside was thick and oppressive, almost like a living thing. As I stepped inside, the air felt stale, filled with the scent of mold and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing scattered debris, old furniture draped in sheets, overturned crates, and a single broken chair that seemed to have been thrown aside in haste. I couldn't help but feel that this place had been a refuge, or perhaps a prison. What had driven the occupants to such desperation? My mind raced with possibilities, fueled by the horror stories I had grown up hearing, narratives that blurred the lines between the real and the imagined. In one corner, I noticed something shiny beneath a layer of dust. It was a small mirror, cracked and dirty, reflecting my worried face back at me. I picked it up, wiping away the grime. A chill swept through me as I stared into the glass. Was it just my imagination, or did I see a flicker of movement behind me? I spun around, heart racing, but the cabin remained silent. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on me, a reminder that I was alone in a place that felt anything but welcoming. Then, from outside, I heard the unmistakable sound of that scream again, but this time it felt closer. It resonated through the trees, chilling me to the bone. I was reminded of the stories, the terrifying tales of spirits that wandered the woods, seeking something lost. I cursed under my breath, realizing I was deep in something I didn't understand. It was one thing to hear park rangers' horror stories around a campfire, another to be living one, with fear clawing at my insides. I dashed back toward the door, but a sudden noise halted me, a soft thud, followed by a whisper. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself it was the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," it seemed to say, echoing through the cabin. My breath hitched. Was I losing my mind? I couldn't tell if the voice was real or just a product of my anxious thoughts. Every horror story I'd ever heard crept into my mind, mingling with my reality. This wasn't a bedtime story. It was something much darker. The whisper clawed at my sanity, pulling me deeper into the cabin's grip. "Help me," it echoed again, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from inside the walls or from my own mind. The weight of the air felt suffocating as I stood frozen, wrestling with the urge to flee and the desperate need to understand. I peered into the shadows, half expecting to see the woman from earlier, her eyes wild with something unnameable. Taking a shaky breath, I called out, "Is anyone there?" The darkness absorbed my words, leaving an eerie silence in return. I felt foolish, yet something compelled me to press forward. My curiosity was stronger than my fear, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run. I took a step toward the source of the whisper, my heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through me. Every nerve in my body screamed that I shouldn't be here. Yet, the promise of an answer held me captive. I turned back to the room, scanning the clutter. I was ready to find something, anything that would explain the dread swirling in the air. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, it illuminated a figure standing in the corner. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat, but as I approached, the figure dissolved into the shadows, a mere trick of the light. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, only to be replaced by the cold grip of fear once more. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound reverberated like thunder, shaking me to my core. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispering had turned into a cacophony, the air heavy with unspeakable tension. In that moment, I could almost feel the weight of every horror story I'd ever heard creeping into reality, forming a sinister tapestry of the unknown. Suddenly, I remembered the stories about the forest, about the things that roamed in the dark. The local legends were rooted in fear and warned of encounters that left souls shaken. I thought of the skinwalker, a being of both this world and the next. The stories felt more real now than ever before. As the echoes of the past swirled around me, I felt an instinctual urge to survive kick in. I had to escape. Summoning every ounce of strength, I pounded on the door, yelling for help, for anyone to hear me. The rain outside grew heavier, a thunderous backdrop to my cries. I knew I couldn't let this place claim me. Finally, with one final desperate push, I threw my shoulder against the door. It creaked open, letting in a rush of cold, damp air that felt like a promise of freedom. I bolted out into the night, the forest alive around me, each sound magnified as I raced back toward my ATV. I didn't stop until I reached the logging road. The rain pelted me, but I didn't care. I revved the engine, my heart racing as I sped away from that cursed place. Behind me, the cabin faded into the shadows, its secrets left buried within the walls. I glanced back once, feeling an unshakable sense of dread settle in my gut. It was a night filled with true horrors, an encounter that would haunt me, lingering like the whispers in the dark, reminding me that not all stories should be uncovered. As I rode away, I vowed never to return to the Hell's Canyon area at night, and I understood now why the locals spoke in hushed tones about park rangers' horror stories. Some tales were better left untold. The rain continued to fall, a soothing sound as I drove into the night, the memories swirling behind me like smoke. I knew one thing for sure. Some narratives are scarier than any bedtime story, and some truths should remain hidden in the shadows. Do you think camping is all about campfires and stargazing? Think again. In this video, you'll hear haunting true stories from park rangers that reveal the dark side of the wilderness, leaving you with a new perspective on your next outdoor trip. If you skip this, you might miss crucial tips that could protect you from unexpected dangers. Stay tuned to find out what every adventurer needs to know before stepping into the wild. It was one of those eerie evenings in Utah's vast desert, where the sky stretched endlessly and the stars shone like scattered diamonds. As a wilderness guide, I spent countless nights camping under the open sky, my truck parked nearby, always ready for the next day's adventure. This time, though, there was an unsettling calm, an unusual quiet that wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. I glanced at my friends as we sat around the dying embers of the fire, the crackling flames giving way to an almost unnatural stillness. "Doesn't it feel a bit off?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled over us. My friends shrugged, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. We were used to the sounds of the wilderness crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, but tonight, the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind, as if nature itself was holding its breath. It was a moment that seemed ripped straight from horror stories, where everything felt too quiet, too perfect. After putting out the fire, we laid out our sleeping bags, trying to dismiss the odd vibe in the air. As I nestled into my bag, the desert temperature dropped, and the stillness around us deepened. I thought about the many nights I had spent in this desolate beauty, the thrill of guiding others through its rugged trails, sharing true stories that sent shivers down their spines. Yet, something about this night felt different. A nagging feeling crept into my mind, but I pushed it aside, trying to focus on sleep. Rain sounds echoed in the distance, reminding me of a soothing sleep aid, lulling me into a false sense of comfort. Just as I started to drift off, a sharp jolt brought me back to reality. Someone grabbed my wrists and jerked my arms straight up into the air. My heart raced as I bolted upright, adrenaline flooding my system. In an instant, my friends were awake, their eyes wide with shock. We all shared the same bewildered expression, caught in that moment of fear. The sensation was as real as the ground beneath us, yet there was no explanation for it. "What the hell just happened?" one of my friends exclaimed, scanning the darkness around us. We exchanged glances, trying to piece together what we had just experienced. Nothing else happened that night, but that moment hung in the air, unshakable and haunting. Even in the calmness of the desert, the hairs on the back of my neck stood tall, a silent reminder of the night's inexplicable encounter. It would become a part of our collection of scary tales, a narrative so bizarre, it felt like it belonged in a scary compilation rather than our reality. After that strange incident, sleep felt elusive. We sat up, huddled close together under the vast sky, trying to rationalize what had just happened. The calm of the desert night was still there, but it felt like a cover for something lurking just beyond our sight. Every whisper of wind seemed like a warning, every shadow cast by the moonlight a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, even though the stars sparkled as if mocking our unease. "I think we should pack up and head out," I suggested, glancing at my friends. They exchanged worried looks, torn between the thrill of the unknown and the instinct to flee. "It's just a weird moment. We've all experienced strange things while camping," one of them replied, attempting to sound brave, yet I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. It reminded me of those true stories where something inexplicable happens in the dead of night, and people are left questioning their sanity. We decided to stay, convincing ourselves that it was just the mind playing tricks. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, I tried to focus on the familiar sounds of the desert crickets chirping, the soft rustling of bushes, but even those seemed muted, distant. It was as if the world outside had decided to pause, creating an oppressive silence. Then, in the midst of this unnerving quiet, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching over the gravel. My heart raced again, and I leaned closer to my friends, whispering about the noise. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, wide-eyed, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, a steady approach that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just one set of footsteps, it felt like multiple presences drawing closer. It was a scene ripped straight from a scary tale where you hear the danger approaching, and there's nowhere to run. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if we were waiting for something to break the stillness. "Maybe it's just an animal," one friend suggested, but his voice trembled. I wasn't convinced. The footsteps were too deliberate, too calculated. They stopped just beyond the reach of our firelight, and we could sense something or someone watching us from the darkness. The night seemed to stretch on, each passing moment a reminder of our vulnerability. We were miles away from civilization, surrounded by vast emptiness, and our minds played tricks, crafting scenarios that could turn this camping trip into a nightmare. As the footsteps continued to echo in the darkness, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My instincts screamed for action, but fear held me paralyzed. My friends and I exchanged anxious glances, silently debating our next move. Should we call out? Should we hide? The quiet pressure of the desert night seemed to stifle our voices. I could almost hear my heart beating in my ears, matching the rhythm of the approaching sounds. "Let's grab our flashlights," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. "We need to see what's out there." My friends nodded hesitantly, scrambling to find their gear. The weight of the moment hung heavily between us, but curiosity had an edge over our fear. As we clicked on our flashlights, the beams pierced the darkness, illuminating patches of the rocky ground and sparse desert shrubs. It felt like a futile attempt to ward off the unseen presence that lurked just beyond our sight. With each sweep of the flashlight, shadows danced and twisted, but nothing stood out as the source of the sound. We stood there, lights flickering nervously, and I could feel my resolve starting to waver. This was no longer just another camping trip. It had transformed into something unsettling. The horror stories I had heard about park rangers and their eerie encounters flooded my mind. What if this night became one of those chilling narratives? Suddenly, a rustling noise came from the bushes to our right. I froze, holding my breath as my friends did the same. The sound was closer now, more deliberate. Then, as if to tease us, noise stopped. An unsettling silence enveloped us once more. I thought about those nighttime stories, how they often culminated in a moment where fear paralyzed the protagonists. This felt exactly like that, a perfect setup for something terrifying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to find out just how real those tales could be. "We need to stick together," I finally said, breaking the suffocating silence. No matter what happens, we formed a tighter circle, our lights illuminating each other's faces, reflecting the fear in our eyes. I could almost hear the rain sounds in the distance again, a reminder of the storms that sometimes rolled through these desolate lands. Those were often moments of reflection, where we shared tales and laughs. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air felt thick with dread, a palpable tension that hinted at something sinister waiting just out of sight. Just as we stood there, a chilling breeze swept through the desert, rustling the nearby bushes and sending shivers down my spine. It felt like a warning, an omen that whatever was lurking in the dark had no intention of revealing itself. I aimed my flashlight toward the source of the noise, but all we found were shadows and rocks, mocking us with their stillness. "This is getting ridiculous," one of my friends muttered, his voice wavering. "Maybe we should just go back to sleep." The thought of retreating to our sleeping bags sounded absurd, but part of me craved the comfort of ignorance. Yet, the unsettling feeling hung over us like a dark cloud. I could almost hear the echoes of other scary stories, the ones that warned about dismissing the strange and unexplained. We couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just our imaginations running wild. There was a weight to the air that felt real, pressing down on us as if it wanted to crush our spirits. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound ceased. The desert fell silent again, and a heavy stillness settled in its place. My heart raced as we strained to listen, expecting something to break the quiet, but it never came. The moment stretched on, and I could feel the anxiety pooling in my gut. The absence of sound felt more terrifying than the noise itself. "Let's just get out of here," I whispered, breaking the silence that had enveloped us. We quickly packed our things, our movements frantic as adrenaline coursed through our veins. The dark had become a suffocating blanket, and with every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs, our minds conjured up worst-case scenarios. We didn't dare turn off our flashlights as we made our way back to the truck. The familiar terrain seemed foreign now, and every shadow danced like a specter in the darkness. Each step felt heavy, laden with the knowledge that something had touched us tonight, even if we couldn't define what it was. As we reached the truck, relief flooded over us. We piled inside, the engine rumbling to life, a comfort against the unsettling silence. Driving away from that spot, I glanced back at the now still desert. It looked just like any other night, but I knew it held secrets. Those were the kinds of tales that linger long after the fires were extinguished, the ones that would haunt the corners of our minds. It wouldn't just be another camping trip. It would be a chilling chapter in our collection of park rangers' horror stories. A reminder that sometimes the true stories are the scariest of all. Are you brave enough to face the dark side of nature? In this video, we unveiled chilling true park ranger horror stories that will have you on the edge of your seat and rethink your next camping trip. You think you're safe in the wilderness, but if you miss these crucial warnings, you could end up in a real-life horror story. Stay tuned to find out the shocking truths that lurk in the shadows of the great outdoors. I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness. There's something comforting about the smell of pine and the rustle of leaves. That night, I had set up camp by a serene lake, miles away from the nearest road, to clear some trails. The sky was overcast, and a gentle rain began to patter down, creating a soothing soundtrack that would typically make me drowsy. But as I settled into my tent, unease crept over me. It was like a sense that something was just off. The stillness of the night was abruptly broken. I had just started to drift off when I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the water. My heart raced, and I bolted upright, peering out of my tent. The lake looked completely undisturbed. "Just the wind," I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. But then it happened again, a loud splash, followed by another and another. Each crash resonated through the trees, a powerful reminder that I was alone, miles from anyone who could help. I grabbed my hatchet and crowbar knife, gripping them tightly. The splashes kept coming, now accompanied by the sound of rolling stones. I crawled out of my tent and scanned the darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight peeking through the clouds. The air was thick with tension. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I could have sworn I saw something shadows moving on the other side of the lake, but the moment I focused, it was gone. Just the wind, right? But it didn't feel that way. Then, without warning, a massive boulder flew across the lake, crashing into the water with a force that sent waves surging toward my campsite. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. The rock looked to be several hundred pounds, wide and towering over me. My mind raced. Was it some kind of animal? An illusion caused by exhaustion? But that thought was quickly overshadowed by a deeper fear. Something or someone was out there, and it wasn't friendly. Panic bubbled up inside me. I thought of horror stories I'd heard around the campfire, narratives scary enough to keep me awake at night. My eyes darted around, trying to pierce the darkness for any sign of movement. Another boulder plummeted into the lake, sending a spray of water high into the air. I clenched my fists, feeling the cold metal of my knife against my palm. It was going to be a long night. I wasn't sleeping, not with this going on. The rain sounds mixed with my racing heart created a symphony of unease as I prepared to face whatever was out there, waiting to pounce. The rain had picked up by then, drumming steadily on my tent and mixing with the distant sound of splashes. Part of me thought about packing up and leaving right then, but that wasn't exactly a safe option. Hiking back in the dark with slippery trails and unseen dangers might have been just as deadly as staying, so I stayed put, hoping the strange sounds would stop. But every few minutes another boulder would crash into the lake, making me wonder if I was dealing with something far beyond my understanding. The rational side of me said it had to be natural, some kind of landslide or freak event, but nothing about it felt right. My thoughts raced between all the stories I had heard over the years. True stories about people encountering the unexplainable deep in the wilderness. The kind of scary stories that are passed around in hushed tones but always dismissed as exaggeration. It was easy to laugh them off when you weren't alone in the dark, with only a thin layer of fabric between you and the unknown. Now those tales seemed a lot more plausible. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind seemed charged with a sinister energy. I heard something then. Above the sound of the rain, a soft scraping, like something heavy dragging across the rocky shoreline. Slowly I moved toward the edge of the lake, peering out into the night. My flashlight cast a narrow beam across the water, illuminating the ripples where the boulders had hit. But just beyond that, I caught the briefest glimpse of movement, something huge and dark shifting in the shadows. It moved too fast for me to see clearly, but it was there, just at the edge of the trees. My pulse quickened, the kind of fear that sinks deep into your bones taking hold. I weighed my options again, stay and face whatever this was, or leave and risk stumbling into worse danger on the trail. It wasn't an easy call. Staying meant confronting whatever was tossing boulders into the lake, something no human or animal should have been able to do. But leaving meant trekking miles through the forest, vulnerable and alone. Neither option sat well with me, but I knew that if I left, I'd be more exposed. At least here I had some shelter and my weapons close by. As the hours dragged on, the sounds continued, sporadic but relentless. Every splash, every echo felt like a reminder that I wasn't alone out here. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat near the fire, hatchet in one hand, cobbler in the other, waiting for the next move. Whatever was out there, I could only hope it wasn't planning to cross the lake. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of rain blending with my frayed nerves. I could hear the forest alive around me, the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves punctuating the otherwise heavy silence. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to pack up and run as far from the lake as possible, but something kept me anchored, an inexplicable need to face whatever was tormenting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tested in some way. Just as I was about to give in to my rising panic, a particularly loud crash echoed through the night. The lake erupted again, but this time it wasn't just a boulder. It felt different, like a warning. I forced myself to stay still, holding my breath. Then I saw it, the unmistakable outline of something large moving along the opposite shore. It was hulking, almost indistinguishable from the shadows around it. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, fatigue blurring the lines of reality. But as I strained my eyes, I realized it was getting closer. I felt my throat tighten and instinct kicked in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice sounding far too small against the roar of the rain. For a moment, there was silence, an unsettling pause that hung in the air. I gripped my hatchet tightly, bracing myself for a response. The figure halted, and I could feel its gaze on me, a heavy presence that made the hairs on my arms stand straight. I demanded, though I wasn't sure if I wanted that. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through me. I heard a low growl, more felt than heard, vibrating through the ground beneath me. It sent chills through my spine. This wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. Fear and anger coiled inside me. I couldn't believe this was happening, not in a place I'd always considered safe. Not among the trees I loved. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I was here to clear trails, not to be haunted by shadows. "I'm not afraid of you," I shouted into the darkness, though I felt the opposite. Another splash echoed behind me, like a taunt, as if whatever it was had circled around to mock me. I felt cornered, both physically and mentally, and I realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a standoff, a battle of wills between me and whatever entity lurked in the dark. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, ready to fight or flee. As shadows danced around the edges of the lake, the dark figure remained still, shrouded in the murky water's reflection. I had no idea what it was, an animal, a human, or something entirely different, but I could feel its energy pulling at me. It wasn't merely a physical threat. It felt psychological, like it was probing my mind for weaknesses. Suddenly, with an ear-splitting crash, another boulder flew through the air. Striking the water just to my left, I stumbled back, splashed by the cold spray. The impact sent a shiver through me, a visceral reminder that whatever this was, it wasn't here to play games. My instincts kicked into high gear. I had to act. "Enough!" I yelled, raising my hatchet, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever I faced. In a moment of reckless bravery, or perhaps foolishness, I decided to charge toward the shadow. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the area just enough to catch a glimpse of what had been haunting me. As I drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was massive, easily towering over me, but its form remained elusive, shifting like a mirage. Panic gripped me tighter than before. Was I truly prepared to confront this entity? Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The rain slowed to a whisper, and silence enveloped the lake. I stood there, breaths coming fast, watching the figure as it seemed to solidify into a shape I recognized. A tree. It had been my mind, my fear that had distorted the reality before me. The rocks were nothing but a landslide. The splashes were the result of the rain washing debris into the water. I felt a strange mix of relief and embarrassment wash over me. I had allowed my imagination to run wild in the face of isolation. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the scene, I realized how fragile the boundary between fear and reality can be. There were no monsters lurking, only the wilderness and its unpredictable nature. The rain sounds faded into a gentle breeze, and the weight of the night lifted. I sat by the lake, reflecting on the experience, knowing I had faced my own psychological battles in the silence of the forest. As I packed my gear, I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. It was just me, the lake, and a night filled with what I now recognized as the true horrors of the mind. And while I would never forget the fear I felt, it became just another story to tell a new chapter in the collection of park rangers' horror stories. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.